35,000 feet above the Atlantic, the cabin of first class glimmered in a haze of muted gold. The air was thick with the quiet arrogance of wealth, crystal glasses resting on linen, silver cutlery laid like ornaments. The hum of engines softened into a gentle lullaby for those who believed nothing could touch them here. Among them sat Evan Callister, a man who built empires out of code and cold logic, a billionaire who once called East Oakland a blind spot for investment without blinking. He sipped his champagne like it was another business deal closing itself, eyes distant, mind already somewhere beyond the clouds. Then Lauren gasped. It was not a small sound. It cut through the hush like glass shattering on marble. The flute slipped from Evan's hand as he turned to see her fingers claw at her chest, her breath hitching in frantic bursts, lips draining to a dusky violet. Her pupils trembled. The color drained from her face. Time seemed to tear open and pour fear directly into the space between heartbeats. A flight attendant bolted forward, voice cracking as it echoed through the cabin. "Is there a doctor on board? Please, someone." Heads lifted, then dipped again. No one moved. Far back in seat 32B, Noah Benson sat frozen with his earbuds dangling. Hoodie pulled up like armor. The world had taught him to make himself small. Since he came out last year, his high school had become a ghost town around him, lockers slamming shut when he passed, whispers scraping like nails behind his back, old friends dropping him like he carried something contagious. The rainbow pin on his chest had been his rebellion, a spark of color in halls that had gone gray. He had promised himself that on this flight, he would keep his head down, just get to Frankfurt, just survive. But Lauren's body convulsed again, and something in him broke free. Noah shot up, his knees rattling against the tray table. The cabin tilted with the motion. He saw the faces twist toward him, silk ties, manicured nails, eyes sharp and cold. The memory of locker room laughter tried to drag him down. But he stepped into the aisle, voice steady though his hands trembled. "I can save her." The words seemed to hang there, too small for the space, too loud to take back. Murmurs erupted like static. Is he serious? A kid? One of those. It burned across the cabin. The word unspoken but searing gay. A boy like him had never been allowed this close to power. And yet here he stood, the rainbow glint on his chest catching the light as if daring the world to look away. Lauren's breath came in fractured shards. Evan's knuckles whitened around her hand. Somewhere deep in the fuselage, the engines howled like distant surf, carrying them all on a path that might not end. Noah's heart drummed a frantic rhythm, but his eyes locked on hers, distant, fading, slipping. He remembered the nights he studied anatomy by the dim lamp in his grandmother's apartment, the way she'd whisper, "Be ready when the world needs you, even if the world laughs first." He walked forward through their disbelief. In that moment, Noah was not the boy they had mocked or erased or shoved to the margins. He was the only one moving while everyone else sat paralyzed by their comfort. And as the shadow of Daddy tightened its grip around a billionaire's perfect life, it was the gay teen in a hoodie they all tried to pretend wasn't there, who refused to stay invisible any longer. If you believe kindness can break through even the walls built from prejudice, subscribe to Heart Stories, because real miracles don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear hoodies and carry hope like oxygen. Lauren's body jerked as another wave of convulsions tore through her. Her breaths came in ragged, broken scraps, each one more shallow than the last. The polished calm of first class fractured into raw panic. Evan Callister clutched her hand as though he could anchor her spirit by sheer force. The skin around his eyes pulled taut with terror. He had faced hostile takeovers, market crashes, courtroom battles, but never this. Not the woman who had built quiet into his chaos, slipping away before his eyes. His empire meant nothing if she stopped breathing here. Noah Benson knelt on the carpet, hoodie pooling around his thin frame like night against the gold of the cabin. His fingers moved without hesitation. The blur of muscle memory born from nights hunched over medical textbooks borrowed from the community library. His voice cut through the clamor with a clarity that startled even him. "She needs aspirin." Now, get her legs elevated. Loosen her clothes. She could be experiencing a pulmonary embolism. The words landed like sharp stones on polished glass, out of place and impossible to ignore. Evan's head snapped up, his face blazing. "You are just a kid," he spat, voice cracking under the strain. "And a gay kid. Who gave you the right to touch my wife?" The words seemed to echo, louder than the engines, louder than Lauren's strangled gasps. Gay, spoken like a slur, flung into the air like it could shatter Noah's resolve the way it had in the halls of his high school. There, it had been carved onto bathroom doors, murmured like poison. Here, it landed like a challenge. Noah didn't flinch. His eyes were cold, steady, carved from something older than 17. "Identity doesn't kill people," he said, voice like a wire pulled taut. "Delay does. Do you want to save her or not?" The sentence sliced through the cabin's hierarchy, severing the chain between wealth and worth. It was not a plea. It was a demand from someone who refused to stay invisible while someone died. For the briefest moment, Evan's expression cracked. His lips trembled as though tasting grief too early. His gaze flicked to Lauren's lips, blue now, her breath shallow and frantic, and back to Noah's unwavering stare. The distance between them dissolved. All that remained was the stark truth: the life of the woman he loved balanced on the hands of the whom he had dismissed as disposable. Evan swallowed hard. His nod was so small it might have been a tremor. But it was enough. A bottle of aspirin appeared, thrust forward by a trembling flight attendant. Noah split the tablet, slipped it under Lauren's tongue, guided her jaw gently to keep her from choking. He lifted her legs with care, easing blood toward her heart, and loosened the collar of her blouse to ease the pressure on her lungs. The cabin that once judged him with quiet cruelty now stared in silence, spellbound and powerless. Every breath Lauren drew seemed stitched together by Noah's determination. The seconds stretched, suspended, until a faint flush returned to her lips. Her chest rose a little steadier. Evan's shoulders sagged, his head dropping as tears streaked soundless down his face. Around them, the wealthy passengers sat frozen witnesses to the collapse of their hierarchy, watching a boy they had sneered at moments before hold the thread between life and death. In that fragile quiet, something irreversible shifted. They had measured Noah by what he was, not who he was, and nearly let someone die because of it. The unspoken lesson clung to the air like smoke. Prejudice does not just wound those it targets, it blinds those who carry it, until even the truth standing in front of them becomes invisible. The applause started as the wheels struck the tarmac in Frankfurt. It rippled like a wave through the cabin, that familiar reflexive cheer passengers offered for safe landings. Yet it sounded hollow in Noah Benson's ears. He sat pressed against the window, hoodie clinging to his damp skin, fingers trembling in his lap as though the adrenaline still hadn't found a way out. He didn't clap. He couldn't. His heart was somewhere else, back on the floor of first class, kneeling beside a woman he had never met, while a world that once pretended he didn't exist held its breath. Lauren lay in the medical stretcher, being wheeled down the jet bridge, her breathing steadier, skin no longer the pallor of ash. Evan Callister walked beside her, a hand hovering near her shoulder as though afraid she might dissolve if he let go. He did not look back. No one did. Cameras flashed from waiting paramedics. Then the blur of hospital corridors swallowed them whole. Noah remained behind, watching the tide of first-class passengers sweep past him without a glance, their faces rearranged into curated relief as if nothing had cracked inside this sealed metal sky. For them, the crisis ended at the runway. For Noah, it had just begun. Somewhere in the terminal, a clock ticked past the time his interview had started. The only pre-med program that had even considered his application, the only one that could have changed the trajectory of his life, was now happening without him. He imagined the empty chair in that white-walled office, his name still printed neatly on a schedule, while his body sat stranded in this airport, wrists quivering from saving someone who would likely never know what he lost to do it. He had spent nights building a resume from scraps, volunteering at clinics, shadowing nurses, tutoring biology to kids who mocked him under their breath, yet it could not compete with the simple fact that he had not shown up. In the world he came from, opportunities did not pause for compassion. They moved on. At the hospital, Evan finally stopped moving. The fluorescent glare flattened his sharp suit into just cloth and shadow as he stood outside Lauren's room, the rise and fall of her chest like a metronome keeping him tethered. For the first time, he saw Noah not as an interruption, but as someone anchored by something he could not name. He stepped forward, voice hoarse, stripped of the armor that had once filled every room he entered. "What do you want?" he asked. "Money, a chance, your name in headlines." Noah lifted his head. Exhaustion pulled in the hollows beneath his eyes. He didn't blink, didn't hesitate. "I want my grandmother to breathe without having to choose between her heart medication and the rent," he said, each word slow and heavy as stone. It wasn't ambition, it wasn't leverage, it was truth laid bare. The billionaire who had once declared entire neighborhoods worthless stood silent, undone not by defiance but by honesty. Evan had measured value in market shares and venture returns, in numbers stacked high enough to block out the sky. Yet here was a boy who carried his family like a fragile flame, cupped in between shaking hands, and still stepped forward when the world told him to disappear. It fractured something in Evan, that realization that courage often comes dressed not in power but in sacrifice. He thought of the portfolio reports waiting on his desk, the investments that promised eternity, and how none of them could buy back the life that had just been restored by someone his world had written off as disposable. The lesson clung to him with unsettling weight. Real strength is not measured by what you can acquire, but by what you are willing to lose to protect someone else. 1 week later, the world looked nothing like polished glass or climate-controlled boardrooms. Evan Callister stood on the cracked concrete steps of an aging apartment block in East Oakland, where the paint peeled like shedding bark and the air smelled faintly of rust and rain. His black car idled at the curb, out of place against the leaning mailboxes and chain-link fences sagging from decades of exhaustion. Lauren stood beside him in a long coat, color returning to her cheeks, though her hands still trembled when the wind cut through. She gazed at the building's crooked windows, her breath fogging as if the cold were seeping straight into her bones. Noah Benson had walked these steps every day of his life. The hallway beyond the chipped door was dim and narrow, lined with family photos fading at the edges. He moved ahead of them, shoulders tense as though expecting the world to collapse under the sudden weight of their presence. This was his universe, the space where ambition shared air with mildew, where every triumph felt temporary. He could hear the steady hiss of the oxygen tank before he saw her. Beneath a crocheted blanket, Mrs. Laverne Benson sat in a recliner so worn it had molded to her shape, silver hair braided loosely over one shoulder, tubes traced from her nose to the small green machine humming at her feet. Her eyes, dark and sharp, locked on Evan with the precision of someone who had lived too long to be impressed. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. "If you came to sprinkle money around to quiet your guilt," she said, voice raspy but unwavering, "turn around. We don't need pity here. We need respect." The words hit like a gavel. Evan's jaw tightened, the instinct to argue flaring before collapsing under the weight of their truth. For years, he had dismissed this entire neighborhood as a liability line on a balance sheet, a blight unworthy of investment. He had not thought of the people breathing inside it, let alone the boy who had dragged his wife back from the edge of death. That ignorance had once felt like pragmatism. Now it felt like shame. Slowly, Evan unknotted the silk tie from his neck. The gesture seemed to drain the air from the room. He lowered himself to one knee on the threadbare rug. The billionaire stripped down to nothing but a man seeking permission to try again. His voice came rough, scraped raw from the effort to speak without armor. "I thought Noah was just a kid," he said, "but he saved my family. And I can't keep living like this world only works if people like him stay invisible. I will rebuild this system even if it starts by learning how to listen." Silence settled heavy as snowfall. Mrs. Laverne's lips pressed together, the faintest tremor pulling at their corners as though she were bearing a smile she refused to show yet. She gave a small nod, slow and deliberate, like the turning of a key in a long-locked door. Lauren's hand found Noah's shoulder. He stood perfectly still, the tension draining from his frame, as if years of being unseen had begun to loosen their grip. Evan stayed kneeling. The carpet pressed indentations into his skin, grounding him more deeply than the penthouse marble ever had. In that moment, he understood that restoring justice was not about tearing down skyscrapers or signing checks. It began here, in this room, acknowledging the humanity he had once overlooked. The lessons seeped in like quiet water. Repairing what prejudice has broken requires more than resources. It demands humility, the willingness to kneel not out of defeat, but out of respect for lives that have endured without ever being seen. 3 months passed, and the world around East Oakland began to shift like soil after a long drought. Where once there had been only crumbling brick in abandoned clinics, scaffolding now climbed toward the sky. Signs marked the birth of the Oakfield Health Initiative, a community medical center unlike anything the neighborhood had seen. It bore Evan Callister's name in the smallest font on the corner plaque, almost an afterthought, while the entrance displayed something else entirely, a mural painted by local students, stretching across the wall in colors that seemed to hum with life. At its center, Noah Benson's rainbow pin gleamed like a tiny beacon in a sea of hands lifting each other up. Inside, the air smelled of fresh paint and promise. The waiting room was lined with books in multiple languages. The walls hung with portraits of neighborhood families instead of corporate donors. Every desk and treatment space had been planned with input from the people who would actually use them. Evan had funded it, but he no longer pretended to own it. He had kept his vow. The building was run entirely by the community it served. And Noah, once the boy they had all tried not to see, now walked its halls as the center's first youth advisor, his badge clipped just beneath that same rainbow pin, which caught the light every time he turned. At the ceremony, his grandmother sat front row, oxygen machine quietly whirring, her eyes bright in a way Noah had not seen in years. She squeezed his hand and whispered that she could finally breathe easy, not just because her lungs would have medicine, but because the world had made room for her grandson to be exactly who he was. For Noah, it was not victory. It was proof that compassion, when carried far enough, could bend even the coldest of systems toward mercy. A letter arrived that afternoon with Stanford's crest pressed into its seal. Full scholarship, pre-medical program. Noah opened it at her kitchen table, the paper trembling in his hands as though it might vanish if he gripped too hard. Mrs. Laverne cried softly behind him, her tears landing on his shoulder like blessings. Far across the city, in a sunlit hospital room, Lauren Callister cradled a newborn wrapped in pale yellow. Her hair clung to her damp temples, her lips curved in exhausted wonder. Evan stood beside her, his palm cupped gently around the baby's head, as though the world might break it if he didn't hold steady. His voice cracked when he spoke. "She won't grow up in a world that despises people like Noah," he said, not looking at anyone but the tiny blinking eyes before him. Lauren smiled, fragile and luminous. "Her name is Laverne Hope Callister," she whispered, "because Noah's grandmother didn't just raise a gay boy. The world tried to discard. She raised the person who saved us all." Later, Noah stood in that room, the weight of the infant warm in his arms. She stared up at him with the solemn wonder only new life carries, and something inside him steadied. The rainbow pin on his chest caught the sunlight, scattering faint prisms across the sheets as if announcing to the air itself that he would never be invisible again. He had once been the boy they laughed at, the boy pushed to the edges like he did not belong. Now, in the quiet glow of a hospital afternoon, he was the proof that belonging was never theirs to grant, it had always been his to claim. Do you believe kindness can rewrite the rules we were told could never change? Subscribe to Heart Stories because the next miracle might be hidden in someone the world is still trying not to see.